My husband thought he was a mastermind when he secretly sold my $800,000 house while I was out of the country. He handed every penny to his mother for a guaranteed business venture. 2 weeks later, their empire collapsed, and they showed up at my penthouse demanding a place to stay. I gave him a cold smile and shut the door in his face. He called the police thinking he had the upper hand. He had no idea his real estate trick was actually a federal crime. My name is Natalie, and I am 33 years old. As a senior commercial real estate appraiser, my life revolves around property values, legal titles, and bulletproof contracts. I thought my marriage was built on the same solid foundation. I was wrong. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to outsmart someone who took advantage of your hard work and kindness. It was a rainy Tuesday afternoon in Seattle. I had just landed after a 2-week consulting trip in Dubai. My body was entirely out of sync from the 14-hour flight, and all I wanted was a hot shower and my own bed. I pulled my suitcase up the familiar driveway of my craftsman-style home. I bought this house 3 years before I even met my husband, Kevin. It was my pride and joy, my separate property secured with my own down payment. I dragged my luggage to the front porch, pulling my keys from my bag. I slid the brass key into the deadbolt. It did not turn. I jiggled it, thinking the cold weather had made the lock stick. Nothing. I tried again, applying more pressure, but the mechanism was blocked. Someone had changed the locks. Before I could pull out my phone, the door swung open. A man I had never seen before stood in the doorway holding a mug of coffee. He looked just as confused as I was. We stared at each other for a long second. He asked me what exactly I was doing standing on his porch. I let out a harsh laugh, telling him I lived right here and asking why he was inside my house. His expression shifted from confused to annoyed. He set his coffee down on my antique console table and crossed his arms. He told me I must have the wrong address and should leave. He said he was the new owner. My heart slammed against my ribs. I stood my ground, my voice rising as I told him I was the legal owner and that my given name was definitely on the property deed. The man shook his head, stepped back, and pulled a folded document from his pocket. He told me he bought this house a week ago in a cash transaction. He said the closing was incredibly fast handled through a private entity, and the owner was practically giving it away. He unfolded the paper and held it up to the glass storm door. I pressed my face close to read the black ink. It was a copy of a quitclaim deed. I scanned the text until I saw the signatures at the bottom. There was Kevin's signature, looking messy and rushed. And right next to it, plain as day, was my signature. Except I never signed that document. I had been 5,000 miles away in Dubai. The notary stamp belonged to someone I had never met. The purchase price listed was exactly $800,000 in cash. The cold Seattle rain started soaking through my trench coat, but I could not feel it. A cold and terrifying clarity suddenly washed over me. Kevin did not just empty a joint checking account. He had orchestrated a fraudulent real estate transaction to liquidate my biggest asset behind my back. My mind raced through the implications. A fake notary, a forged signature, a cash buyer. This was not a misunderstanding. This was a calculated, deliberate theft by the man I shared a life with. The strange man behind the door asked if I was going to be a problem, threatening to call the local police. I looked at my beautiful house, the warm light spilling from the windows I had painted myself. I took a slow, deep breath, grabbed my heavy suitcase handle, and told him the police would definitely be getting involved, but not for him. I slowly walked back down the concrete driveway, my luggage splashing through the cold puddles. I pulled out my phone and dialed Kevin's number. The loud dial tone rang in my ear. It was time to find out exactly how arrogant my husband truly was. The line connected on the third ring. Kevin picked up with a cheerful, exaggerated tone that made my stomach turn. He asked how the desert was and if I bought him any luxury watches duty-free. I did not say hello. I asked him directly why there was a strange man standing in the living room of my house. There was a brief pause on the other end. Then Kevin let out a dramatic sigh, as if I were a child asking a stupid question. He told me I was supposed to land on Wednesday and that I was ruining his big surprise. I gripped the phone tighter, telling him it was Tuesday, and I was standing in the pouring rain looking at a forged property deed. I demanded to know exactly what he did. Kevin laughed. It was a condescending chuckle that echoed through the phone speaker. He told me to calm down and stop throwing around ugly words like forged. He casually admitted that he used a general power of attorney to expedite the sale while I was out of the country. He said we were married, so technically my assets were his assets, and he simply made a bold executive decision for our future. He spoke as if stealing my property was a favor. I stood frozen on the sidewalk, feeling the cold rain seep into my shoes. I reminded him in a dangerously quiet voice that the house was my sole separate property, purchased entirely with my own money years before I ever put a ring on his finger. I asked him where the $800,000 was. He told me it was safe and that I needed to trust my husband. He proudly announced that he wired the entire sum to his mother, Brenda. My vision actually blurred for a second. I asked him to repeat himself, praying I had misunderstood. I asked why he would ever give my life savings to a woman who had never held a steady job in her life and who treated every pyramid scheme like a golden ticket. Kevin immediately raised his voice, defending his mother. He told me Brenda had exclusive access to an elite offshore commercial venture. He spoke with the unearned confidence of a man who watched too many finance videos online. He bragged that this fund guaranteed a 300% return on investment within 30 days. He said his mother was a visionary and that they were pooling their resources to build an empire. He demanded I stop being so narrow-minded and thank him for multiplying our wealth. I felt a sickening wave of realization. He had taken my hard-earned equity and dumped it into a guaranteed fraud. As an appraiser, I knew the market inside and out. There is no such thing as a guaranteed 300% return. I told him he had just thrown away my house on a scam. I demanded he call the bank and reverse the wire transfer immediately before the funds cleared international waters. Instead of apologizing, Kevin became furious. He accused me of being financially illiterate. He said I might know how to value boring commercial real estate, but I had no idea how to hustle like a true entrepreneur. He told me I was ungrateful and that he was exhausted from always trying to pull me out of my safe little comfort zone. He said a good wife would support his financial genius instead of interrogating him like a criminal. He demanded absolute praise for stepping up and being the man of the house. I asked him where I was supposed to sleep tonight since my house was currently occupied by a stranger. Kevin let out an annoyed groan like I was burdening him with a trivial detail. He told me to just pull out my credit card and rent a motel room down by the highway. He said a few weeks in a budget room would build my character and keep me humble. He casually mentioned that he could not help me right now because he and Brenda were currently at a high-end steakhouse celebrating their massive investment with a bottle of imported champagne. I stared down at my soaked luggage. The man I married was drinking expensive champagne, bought with my stolen house money, while telling me to go sleep in a cheap roadside motel. I asked him exactly which steakhouse they were at. He proudly named a ridiculously expensive restaurant downtown, boasting that they were sitting at the chef's table where winners belonged. He told me to go dry off, check into a motel, and call him back when I was ready to apologize for disrespecting his mother and his business acumen. He said he would not tolerate my toxic negativity anymore. Then he hung up. The dial tone buzzed in my ear, blending with the sound of the Seattle rain. I did not cry. I did not scream. I slid my phone back into my pocket. He wanted a supportive wife, but he was going to get a forensic nightmare. I grabbed my suitcase handle and walked toward the main road to hail a cab. I was not going to a motel. I was going directly to that steakhouse. The cab ride to downtown Seattle took 20 minutes. I used that time to pull up the voice memo app on my phone. I tested the microphone, tapping it twice to make sure it picked up clear audio. I was not going to yell or cause a scene. I was going to collect evidence. The cab pulled up to the valet stand of the most exclusive steakhouse in the city, the kind of place that required reservations months in advance unless you tipped the maitre d' $100 bill. I walked through the heavy mahogany doors, dragging my slightly damp suitcase behind me. The host tried to stop me looking at my trench coat and luggage, but I ignored him completely. I scanned the dimly lit dining room, listening over the soft, ambient jazz music until I heard a familiar, obnoxious laugh. Kevin and his mother Brenda were sitting at a prime corner booth near the open kitchen. The table was covered with empty oyster shells, a massive tomahawk steak, and a tall silver bucket holding a second bottle of imported champagne. They were toasting each other, completely oblivious to the fact that they had just committed a major federal crime. I slid my phone into my front pocket, making sure the recording was running smoothly. Then I walked over and stood right next to their table. Kevin looked up mid-bite. His jaw dropped and he nearly choked on his expensive steak. He scrambled to wipe his mouth with a crisp linen napkin, asking what I was doing there and how I found them. I did not answer him right away. I just stared at the extravagant feast paid for by the blatant theft of my property. Brenda did not look surprised at all. She slowly set down her crystal champagne flute and leaned back in the plush leather booth. She looked me up and down with a deeply condescending smirk. Brenda told me I looked like a drowned rat and that it was incredibly rude to interrupt a private business dinner. I asked her calmly if she considered stealing my house a legitimate business venture. Brenda scoffed and waved her hand dismissively. She said I was being overly dramatic and that I needed to lower my voice before I embarrassed my husband in public. She told me Kevin did what any real man should do and took full control of the family finances. I kept my voice perfectly level, asking her how she justified taking $800,000 that I earned entirely on my own. That was when Brenda delivered a speech so vile, I was actually grateful my phone was recording every single word. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on the white tablecloth, and looked me dead in the eyes. She told me that a wife does not own anything separate from her husband. She said the moment I said my vows, my money became his money, to manage as he saw fit. She mocked my career, calling my job as a commercial appraiser a masculine pursuit that was completely rotting my brain. She said real women focus on raising children and keeping a warm home, not flying to Dubai and acting like corporate sharks. She laughed, saying it was truly pathetic that I was 33 years old with a successful business but absolutely no babies to show for it. She told me Kevin deserved a massive financial return on investment for putting up with a cold, ambitious woman like me. Kevin nodded along, looking fully emboldened by his mother. He told me to go to a motel, pack my remaining clothes, and wait for him to give me a small allowance from his new profits. He actually believed he was completely in charge. I did not cry. I did not raise my voice or throw a glass of ice water in their faces. I simply stood there absorbing their absolute delusion. I memorized the arrogant smirk on Brenda's face and the pathetic smugness in Kevin's eyes. I let them talk, letting the hidden microphone capture every admission of guilt, every detail of the unauthorized bank transfer, and every ounce of their malicious intent. When Brenda finally finished her toxic, misogynistic rant, she picked up her champagne glass and told me to run along. I looked at the expensive food on Kevin's plate. I told him he should enjoy every single bite of that meal because it was going to be the very last luxury he would ever taste. I told Brenda her guaranteed business venture was nothing but a mirage and that she had just dragged her precious golden boy into a legal nightmare he could never escape. Kevin laughed loudly, calling me paranoid and jealous. I did not say another word. I turned my back on them and walked straight out of the restaurant, leaving them to their stolen feast. The recording was saved securely to my cloud drive. The trap was officially set, and they had just willingly handed me the rope to hang them with. I walked out of that steakhouse into the cool night air, feeling an intense and terrifying calm. I did not go to a budget motel like Kevin suggested. I hailed a cab, went to a luxury hotel downtown, booked a premium suite, and opened my laptop. I spent the entire night pulling every digital file, every bank statement, and every property record I could access. By the time the sun came up over the Seattle skyline, I was ready for war. At exactly 8 in the morning, I walked into the sleek glass-walled office of my attorney, Oliver. Oliver was not a family lawyer who handled emotional divorces or custody battles. He was a ruthless corporate litigator specializing in high-stakes real estate fraud. He dismantled shell companies and ruined corrupt developers for a living. I sat down in the leather chair across from his massive mahogany desk and handed him my phone. I played the audio recording from the restaurant. Oliver sat perfectly still listening to Brenda deliver her toxic speech about wives owing their assets to their husbands. He listened to Kevin proudly admit he took the money and wired it to an offshore venture. When the recording finally ended, Oliver did not even blink. He just reached for his keyboard and logged directly into the county property database. Within minutes, he pulled up the official high-resolution scan of the quitclaim deed that had been filed the previous week. He turned his monitor so I could see it. I leaned in and studied the document. The signature at the bottom was a decent forgery, but as an appraiser who looks at contracts all day, I immediately saw the flaws. The pressure was wrong and the loops were too rigid, but the signature was not the smoking gun. I pulled my passport out of my bag and slammed it on his desk, open to the entry and exit stamps from the United Arab Emirates. I pointed out that the document was allegedly signed and notarized in Seattle exactly 3 days ago. I was 5,000 miles away in Dubai on that exact date. Oliver smiled a very sharp and dangerous smile. He zoomed in on the circular notary stamp next to my forged signature. He typed the notary registration number into his state legal database. A few seconds later, he let out a short laugh. He told me Kevin had made a catastrophic mistake. The notary who stamped that deed was a man whose license had been permanently revoked 2 years ago for processing fake titles for stolen vehicles. Kevin had actively sought out a disgraced criminal to push the fraudulent paperwork through the system. Oliver leaned across his desk and laid out the reality of the situation. He explained that Kevin was operating under the delusion that because we were married, he had a right to manage my assets. But Washington state law is very clear about sole and separate property. Because I bought that house before the marriage, using my own funds, Kevin had absolutely no legal authority over it. By hiring a fake notary and forging my name on a legal document, Kevin had crossed a massive line. This was no longer a messy marital dispute over shared bank accounts. This was outright felony forgery. But Oliver told me it actually got much worse for Kevin. He asked me to confirm what Kevin said on the phone about wiring the $800,000 to his mother. I nodded, telling him Kevin proudly admitted he wired the entire sum to Brenda so she could invest it in some guaranteed offshore commercial venture. Oliver steepled his fingers and looked at me with cold calculation. He explained that by using the banking system to move stolen funds across state or international lines, Kevin and Brenda had just committed federal wire fraud. That was a crime that carried a mandatory prison sentence. Kevin thought he was a financial genius. He thought he had outsmarted a woman he considered nothing more than a stubborn obstacle. Instead, he had left a massive glowing trail of digital and physical evidence proving he committed multiple felonies. Oliver asked me exactly how I wanted to proceed. He said we could call the police right now and have Kevin arrested before lunch. I looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the city below. I thought about Kevin mocking my career. I thought about Brenda telling me my worth was tied to giving her son babies, while she spent the money I worked years to save. I turned back to Oliver and told him calling the police today was too easy. I wanted Kevin and Brenda to reach the absolute peak of their arrogance. I wanted them to spend every dime of their fake wealth until the illusion completely shattered. I told Oliver I wanted to build an airtight federal case that would leave them with absolutely nothing. Oliver nodded slowly, pulling a fresh legal pad toward him. The legal trap was set, and I was ready to watch them walk right into it. I walked out of Oliver's office feeling a strange sense of control. The rain had stopped leaving the Seattle streets slick and gray. I headed to a quiet coffee shop near my hotel to organize my real estate files. I needed to document every single improvement I had made to the house to prove its exact market value before the fraudulent sale. Just as I opened my laptop, my phone vibrated against the wooden table. It was not a standard text message. It was a notification from a secure encrypted messaging app I rarely used. I unlocked my screen and opened the app. A message from an unknown number sat at the top of the inbox. It contained a single line of text asking if I was in a secure location. I frowned and typed back a quick yes, asking who was messaging me. A few seconds later, a massive encrypted file dropped into the chat, followed by a name that made me sit straight up in my chair. It was Naomi. Naomi was 32 years old, an African-American woman who had the unfortunate luck of marrying Kevin's younger brother. Naomi and I had always shared a quiet mutual respect, but we were never exceptionally close. She was a senior forensic accountant for a massive corporate firm. She was brilliant, sharp, and entirely unbothered by nonsense. But Brenda despised her. At every family gathering, Brenda would constantly hurl thinly veiled racist microaggressions at Naomi. Brenda would make passive-aggressive comments about Naomi's natural hair or act shocked that Naomi made more money than her husband. Brenda treated Naomi like an outsider who had infiltrated their perfect family. Naomi always responded with a cold, polite smile, but I knew she was secretly keeping score. I tapped the screen and asked Naomi what she had just sent me. Her response came through immediately. She typed that she heard Kevin bragging to the entire family group chat about securing a massive offshore investment using my house money. She said Kevin was parading around acting like a Wall Street billionaire, but his math was completely insulting to anyone with a functioning brain. Naomi wrote that she decided to do some digging into Brenda's so-called elite commercial venture just for her own amusement. What she found was a financial disaster. I opened the secure file on my laptop. It was a masterpiece of forensic accounting. Naomi had mapped out the entire money trail. She tracked the $800,000 from the fake cash buyer to a temporary escrow account. From there, she traced the wire transfer to a shell corporation registered in Delaware. But Naomi did not stop there. She pierced the corporate veil and followed the money straight to a holding account in the Cayman Islands. She attached a summary report proving the offshore fund was completely fake. It was a classic Ponzi scheme running on newly recruited money. My phone buzzed again. Naomi called me directly through the encrypted app. I answered immediately. Her voice was calm but laced with absolute venom. She told me Brenda had spent the last 5 years treating her like a second-class citizen, and she was finally done playing the bigger person. Naomi said she knew I was going to destroy them, and she wanted to hand me the matches. She explained that the people running the Ponzi scheme were already under federal investigation, and it was only a matter of time before the entire fund was frozen. I felt a genuine smile spread across my face for the first time in days. I told Naomi about the fake notary and the wire fraud charges Oliver was drafting. I could hear Naomi laughing softly on the other end of the line. She told me Kevin and Brenda were currently planning a massive, extravagant family party to show off their fake wealth. They were spending money on credit, expecting the massive guaranteed returns to pay off their balances. We quickly formed our alliance. Naomi agreed to stay embedded in the family, playing the quiet, observant daughter-in-law. She would monitor their spending, track any new bank accounts they opened, and feed me every single piece of financial data. I would work with Oliver to quietly seal the federal trap around them. Naomi warned me that I had to play the part of the defeated wife for just a little longer. I had to let Kevin believe he had actually won. I thanked Naomi, telling her she was the greatest ally I could ever ask for. I hung up the phone and looked at the forensic report on my screen. Kevin thought he had outsmarted me, but he had just started a war against a real estate appraiser and a forensic accountant. He had absolutely no chance. Over the next week, my phone became a non-stop feed of Kevin's extreme arrogance. I stayed in my luxury hotel suite working remotely and building my appraisal files while Kevin waged his pathetic version of psychological warfare. The first text arrived on Thursday morning while I was reviewing a commercial property contract. It was a screenshot of a highly questionable financial dashboard. The interface looked cheap, like a hastily coded mobile app, but the numbers glowing in the center of the screen were massive. The balance showed $1.2 million. Beneath the image, Kevin typed a single sentence. "Look at what a real man can do while you sit in a cheap motel." I did not reply immediately. I let the silence stretch for 2 hours, letting his ego swell. Eventually, another text vibrated against my desk. He told me I should be thanking him because his mother's elite connections had just exponentially increased our net worth. Naomi's advice echoed in my mind. I had to play the part of the defeated and confused wife. I had to make him feel like he was the smartest person in the room so he would keep talking. I picked up my phone and typed back slowly. I asked him if that money was actually real and if it was truly safe. I added that I was just scared because I had never seen numbers like that before. He took the bait instantly. He replied that the funds were completely secure in a protected offshore account, and that I needed to stop being so deeply insecure. I took a screenshot of his message, saving it to my secure folder. Then I sent my trap. I asked how he even managed to fund such a massive account, considering we barely had $50,000 in our joint checking. I needed him to explicitly state the source of the money in writing. I watched the typing bubbles appear and disappear. When his text finally came through, it was a masterpiece of self-incrimination. Kevin wrote that he obviously used the $800,000 from the house. He actually typed that he took the initiative to hire a private notary to push the quitclaim deed through, so I would not have to worry about the boring paperwork. He openly confessed to forging the legal document and bypassing my consent, dressing it up as a husbandly favor. I immediately forwarded that screenshot directly to Oliver. Kevin was on a roll and could not stop bragging. He sent another image showing a fake projection chart where their supposed wealth skyrocketed to $5 million. He told me that if I ever wanted to see a single dime of that new wealth, I needed to completely drop my bad attitude. He demanded a full formal apology for the way I spoke to him and Brenda at the steakhouse. He said his mother was the true visionary of the family and I needed to learn my place. I played my part perfectly. I texted back saying I was just in shock about the house because it was my separate property that I worked years to buy before our wedding. I asked him to promise that he would buy me a new house once his returns finally cleared. Kevin replied with a laughing emoji. He texted that the concept of separate property was a toxic myth. He proudly declared that he sold the house because he knew what was best. He added that he would be buying a new mansion strictly under his own name to protect our assets from my emotional decision-making. I took another screenshot. This was pure legal gold. Oliver had warned me that proving malicious intent in fraud cases can sometimes be difficult because spouses often claim it was simply a mutual financial misunderstanding. But Kevin was systematically destroying any possible legal defense. He was explicitly stating in writing that he acted entirely alone, bypassed my legal rights, and claimed sole ownership of the stolen funds. The messages kept coming relentlessly. Every time he bought something ridiculous, he sent me photographic evidence: a leased luxury sports car, a solid designer watch. He ended the week with a final ultimatum. He texted that he was giving me 48 hours to crawl back, apologize to Brenda, and accept my new role as an obedient wife. If I complied, he would put me on a strict monthly allowance. If I refused, he would leave me with nothing. I replied with a simple message saying, "I understand perfectly." Kevin sent back a thumbs up, fully believing he had broken my spirit. He had no idea his own text messages were the exact evidence federal prosecutors would use to destroy his life. The mass email invitation to Brenda's extravagant family reunion arrived in my inbox on Friday morning. She had rented a sprawling historic estate on the edge of the city for the entire weekend just to show off her imaginary wealth. Saturday afternoon marked exactly 48 hours since Kevin issued his ridiculous ultimatum demanding my obedience. I decided it was the perfect time to make an appearance. I did not wear the soft floral dresses Kevin always preferred me to wear. I wore a sharply tailored charcoal gray power suit, sleek black heels, and a dark red lip. I drove my rental car up the long gravel driveway and parked behind a leased Italian sports car. It was Kevin's new toy gleaming under the afternoon sun. I walked through the massive double doors of the estate. The scene inside was a masterclass in tacky, newly rich desperation. Brenda had hired a full catering staff, a live string quartet, and a professional bartender pouring top-shelf liquor. There was an actual ice sculpture shaped like a dollar sign melting slowly near the caviar station. Brenda was holding court in the center of the grand living room, wearing an overly sequined dress and clutching a neon green designer handbag that still had the protective plastic wrapped around the hardware. She was loudly bragging to a group of elderly aunts about her genius in the world of high finance. I stood by the entryway scanning the crowded room. I spotted Naomi standing near the catered dessert buffet. She was dressed impeccably, but was keeping her distance from the main crowd. We locked eyes for a brief second. She gave me a barely noticeable nod and slowly tapped her crystal champagne glass with one manicured finger. She had already pulled the catering invoices and venue rental agreements. They were burning through my stolen money at a terrifying rate. Kevin noticed me a moment later. His face lit up with a smug, victorious smile. He genuinely believed I was there to surrender and beg for my monthly allowance. He excused himself from a conversation with his uncle and marched toward me. He was wearing a ridiculously expensive tailored velvet jacket and a gold watch that looked heavy enough to double as a weapon. He stepped into my personal space, immediately trying to assert his physical dominance. He leaned in close, his breath smelling heavily of expensive scotch and imported cigars. He told me he was glad I finally came to my senses and realized who was in charge. He said I looked a little too corporate for a fun family party, but he was willing to generously overlook my outfit if I went over and publicly apologized to his mother. I looked at him with absolute zero emotion. I told him I was not there to apologize to anyone. Kevin frowned, his smug expression rapidly faltering. He glanced around the room, nervously checking if any of his relatives were watching our interaction. He lowered his voice to a harsh, aggressive whisper, telling me not to embarrass him in front of his entire family. He reached out and aggressively grabbed my upper arm, tightly gripping the fabric of my suit jacket. He tried to physically pull me toward the center of the living room, to force me into playing the role of the loving, supportive wife. I did not pull away frantically. I simply stopped walking, anchoring my weight to the floor. I looked down at his hand gripping my arm, and then looked directly into his panicked eyes. My voice was dangerously quiet, but sharp enough to cut completely through the background noise of the string quartet. I told him if he did not remove his hand from my body this exact second, I would break his fingers and then call the police to report an assault. Kevin blinked in absolute shock. He had fully expected me to shrink away and be afraid of causing a public scene. Instead, I was offering him a direct, violent threat. He immediately released my arm, stepping back quickly as if he had been physically burned. He tried to recover his heavily bruised ego by laughing nervously and adjusting his expensive collar. He told me I was acting completely crazy and that I seriously needed to calm down. I smoothed the sleeve of my suit jacket, perfectly unbothered. I told him he was standing in a rented house drinking liquor bought with stolen money and wearing a watch he could not actually afford. I said the only crazy thing in this room was his pathetic belief that this fake empire was going to last another week. Brenda noticed us talking and started walking over her neon handbag, swinging wildly on her arm. She called out loudly, asking if I had finally decided to join the winning team. She told me I should grab a plate of expensive food and learn how successful people truly lived. I turned to face her, offering a cold, brilliant smile. I thanked her for the invitation, but said I could not stay long. I told her I just came to see what financial delusion looked like in person. Before Brenda could process the insult or formulate a response, I turned on my heel and walked out the heavy double doors. I left Kevin standing there sweating in his velvet jacket while his mother sputtered in outrage. They had their lavish party, but they were celebrating on a ticking time bomb. I pushed through the heavy doors leading to the garden terrace. I had intended to walk straight to my car, but the catering staff was already ushering guests toward a massive banquet table under fairy lights. I spotted Naomi near the far end. I realized this was my chance to make physical contact before the fallout. I smoothly slid into the empty chair next to her. Kevin and Brenda made their way to the terrace, taking seats at the head of the table. Kevin looked rattled, adjusting his velvet jacket, but Brenda was glowing with toxic pride. She tapped a spoon against her crystal flute, demanding silence from the guests. She raised her glass to toast, rambling about family wealth and how her unparalleled financial instincts secured their legacy. Then Brenda did what she always did. She needed a scapegoat, so she turned her attention to Naomi. Brenda sighed dramatically, saying it was a shame not everyone understood high-level investment. She looked at Naomi with a venomous smile. She said loudly that it must be exhausting working a miserable 9-to-5 job, crunching other people's numbers. The table went completely quiet. Naomi did not flinch. She just continued slicing her salad, her posture absolutely perfect. Brenda chuckled, taking a sip of her champagne. She told the entire table that Naomi was nothing but a glorified calculator. She said it was cute that Naomi wore expensive business suits, but at the end of the day, she was just a hired worker bee, while people like Kevin were the actual visionaries building true generational wealth. Brenda even had the audacity to add a thinly veiled racist comment, saying she was surprised Naomi had not just settled for a low-level clerk job, considering her background. Kevin laughed loudly from the head of the table, eager to regain his confidence after our confrontation. He pointed his steak knife at Naomi and told her she should take some notes from his mother. He said maybe if Naomi stopped being so obsessed with boring audits and tax codes, her own husband would actually respect her. It was a vile, coordinated attack designed to break a brilliant woman down in front of her extended family. The air around the table grew thick with uncomfortable tension. A few relatives shifted awkwardly in their seats, but nobody dared to speak up against the woman funding the open bar. I felt my blood pressure spike, my hands curling into fists under the white linen tablecloth. I was ready to tear Brenda apart verbally, but I felt a sudden sharp tap on my knee. I glanced sideways. Naomi was looking straight ahead at Brenda, wearing the most chilling, composed smile I had ever seen. Naomi calmly set her fork down and told Brenda she was absolutely right. She said she really was just a woman who looked very closely at numbers, and that Brenda should definitely keep that in mind. Brenda scoffed, entirely missing the lethal double meaning in Naomi's words. Brenda proudly stated that she only concerned herself with the big picture, not the boring little math problems. As Brenda launched into another ridiculous story about her fake offshore connections, Naomi slipped her hand under the table. I opened my palm, resting on my lap. I felt the cold, hard plastic of a small object press into my hand. It was a flash drive. Naomi kept her eyes locked on Brenda, acting like she was mesmerized by the speech, while her fingers securely pressed the drive into my grip. I curled my fingers around the USB drive and slid it seamlessly into my suit pocket. Naomi leaned over, pretending to reach for her water glass, and whispered a single sentence meant only for me. She softly said, the drive contained the complete forensic audit of the Ponzi scheme, including the exact names of the 12 relatives sitting at this very table who Brenda had illegally recruited. She whispered that the entire house of cards was going to collapse in less than 12 hours. I looked at Brenda, who was still laughing loudly and demanding the waiter bring her another bottle of imported champagne. She was publicly humiliating the exact woman who held the complete federal blueprint to her destruction. She was insulting a brilliant forensic accountant while actively committing massive financial fraud. It was almost poetic. I took a slow sip of my sparkling water, feeling the heavy weight of the flash drive in my pocket. I did not need to stay a minute longer. I stood up from the table, pushing my chair back quietly. Let Brenda have her moment of racist, elitist glory. It was going to be the last happy memory she would ever have. I pushed my chair back from the table. The legs scraped loudly against the stone patio, drawing the attention of the entire party. I did not rush. I smoothed the front of my charcoal suit and reached over to a silver tray held by a passing waiter. I picked up a fresh flute of champagne. I held it up, turning my body to face the head of the long table where Brenda and Kevin were sitting. The conversations around the terrace completely died down. I raised my glass high. I told the crowd I wanted to propose a toast to my husband and my mother-in-law. Kevin puffed out his chest, a smug smile returning to his face. He actually thought I was finally submitting to his authority in front of his relatives. I kept my voice perfectly steady, projecting it clearly across the silent garden. I congratulated them on their incredible and incredibly fleeting success. I said that in my line of work as a commercial appraiser, we learn very early that artificial inflation always corrects itself. I told them that a house of cards looks exactly like a luxury mansion, right up until the wind blows. I looked directly into Kevin's eyes and told him to enjoy the peak of his imaginary empire because gravity was a very unforgiving force. The silence that followed was deafening. Kevin's smile vanished instantly, replaced by a look of sheer confusion and rising panic. I took a slow sip of the champagne, set the crystal glass down softly on the table, and walked away. I did not look back. I could feel the collective shock of 50 relatives staring at my back. I walked through the massive house and out the front double doors, stepping into the cool evening air. The gravel crunched under my heels as I approached my rental car. I had just unlocked the driver's side door when I heard heavy, desperate footsteps running behind me. It was Kevin. He had chased me all the way down the long driveway, leaving his own party. His face was flushed red and he was breathing heavily. The arrogant smirk was completely gone, replaced by a frantic, paranoid energy. He demanded to know exactly what I meant by that toast. He asked if I knew something about the investment fund that he did not. He started rambling nervously about the mobile dashboard, saying the numbers were still going up, but admitting that the lead broker had ignored his last 3 phone calls. Kevin's voice cracked as he asked me if the money was actually safe. The psychological warfare had worked perfectly. I had planted the seed of deep doubt, and his own underlying guilt was watering it. I leaned casually against the door of my rental car, looking at the man who had stolen my life savings. I told him he was the financial genius and he should trust his own gut. I reminded him that he was the one who deliberately forged a legal document to gamble my money away, so he better hope his mother was exactly as smart as she claimed to be. Kevin grabbed his hair, pacing frantically in front of my car. He started muttering that maybe they should pull the initial $800,000 out just to be safe. He pulled his phone from his velvet jacket pocket, frantically opening the fake investment app. He tapped the screen repeatedly, his panic rising visibly when the withdrawal button remained entirely grayed out. He cursed under his breath, realizing he had no control over the funds. Before he could dial his broker again, Brenda marched out of the front doors. She stomped down the driveway, her neon designer bag swinging aggressively by her side. She grabbed Kevin by the shoulder, yanking his phone out of his hand. She yelled at him, asking why he was acting like a terrified child in the dark. She pointed a manicured finger at me, telling Kevin I was just a bitter, jealous woman trying to ruin their beautiful celebration out of spite. Kevin looked at his mother, his eyes wide with genuine fear. He quietly mentioned that the broker was not answering and the withdrawal page was completely locked. Brenda let out a harsh, dismissive laugh, waving her hand in the air. She told him he was being weak and embarrassing the entire family. She said elite offshore funds always lock capital for the first 30 days to maximize the massive compound returns. She gaslit him flawlessly, telling him that if he pulled out now, he would lose millions in guaranteed profit. She placed her hands on his face, using a sickly sweet, manipulative tone to tell him he was a visionary, and true visionaries do not listen to terrified wives. I watched Kevin swallow hard. He looked at my calm expression and then back at his mother. His pathological need for his mother approval and his own blinding greed won the internal battle. He nodded slowly, taking his phone back from Brenda. He straightened his velvet jacket and glared at me, telling me I was just trying to manipulate him because I was currently broke. I smiled warmly at both of them. I got into my car, started the engine, and rolled down the window. I told them to have a truly wonderful night. I drove slowly down the gravel driveway, leaving them standing alone in the dark. I glanced at the flash drive sitting in my passenger seat. Naomi had delivered the final piece of the puzzle. I just had to wait for the morning to watch their world end. I woke up the next morning feeling incredibly refreshed. The sun was shining through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my hotel suite, casting a warm glow across the room. I ordered a black coffee from room service and sat down at the desk, opening my laptop. I plugged in the flash drive Naomi had given me the night before. I was reviewing the meticulous spreadsheets detailing Brenda fraudulent recruitment network when my phone screen lit up with a breaking news alert from a major financial network. The headline made me smile, a genuine, deeply satisfied smile. Federal agents raid massive offshore Ponzi scheme. I grabbed the remote and turned on the television mounted on the wall. The morning news anchor was standing in front of a sleek corporate office building in downtown Miami. Federal agents wearing blue windbreakers with SEC printed in bold yellow letters were carrying cardboard boxes, computer servers, and hard drives out of the glass doors. The anchor announced that the Securities and Exchange Commission had executed an emergency asset freeze on the exact commercial venture Brenda had been bragging about for weeks. The operation was entirely a sham. There were no offshore commercial properties. There were no elite networking groups. There were no guaranteed returns. It was a classic pyramid structure that had just collapsed under its own weight. The domains were seized and the digital accounts were completely locked down. My stolen $800,000 had essentially vaporized into thin air. My phone started ringing loudly against the wooden desk. It was Kevin. I let it go to voicemail. 2 seconds later, it rang again. I silenced it and took a slow sip of my hot coffee. The barrage of text messages started flooding my screen rapidly. Kevin was no longer the arrogant financial genius demanding an apology. His texts were frantic, a chaotic string of typos and sheer panic. He texted that the investment app was showing a blank screen. He wrote that the website had a federal seizure notice on the homepage. He said he had called the lead broker 20 times, but the number was completely disconnected. He was begging me to answer the phone, asking if I knew any high-level corporate lawyers who could force the government to release his money. He actually believed he still had money to release. He had not yet realized that in a Ponzi scheme, the late investors are the ones paying the early investors. His massive cash injection had simply paid off someone else before the SEC shut the whole operation down. He was completely broke. I watched his text messages switch from frantic panic to full-blown terror. He realized he had leased luxury sports cars, rented a historic estate, and ordered premium catering on credit cards he could no longer pay off. The family party was supposed to run through Sunday afternoon, but the illusion was already completely dead. A message popped up from Naomi. It was short and brutally descriptive. She wrote that the caterers had just threatened to call the police because Brenda's credit card was declined for the final party payment. Naomi added that Brenda was currently having a hysterical meltdown in the grand foyer, blaming Kevin for ruining her life. The woman who just 12 hours ago told her son to ignore his terrified wife and trust her elite vision was now aggressively throwing him directly under the bus. Naomi said relatives were quietly packing their bags and sneaking out the back doors to avoid the embarrassment. The great empire had collapsed before they even served breakfast. I picked up my phone and finally listened to the single voicemail Kevin had managed to leave. His voice was shaking and barely recognizable. He was hyperventilating, crying directly into the receiver. He told me the money was gone. He said Brenda had tricked him and that he was so sorry for everything. He begged me to let him come back home, saying we could figure this out together as a team. He said he desperately needed his wife. I deleted the voicemail without a second thought. We were not a team. He had chosen his team when he forged my signature and handed my life savings to a woman who openly despised me. I texted Oliver a quick update. He replied instantly, confirming he was already preparing the civil suit and the federal wire fraud evidence to hand over to the authorities. Kevin and Brenda were currently panicking about bounced checks and canceled credit cards. They had no idea the real storm had not even hit them yet. They were entirely focused on the SEC seizing their fake profits. They did not realize that I was coming for their actual freedom. I closed my laptop, finished my coffee, and started packing my bags. It was time to leave the hotel and sign the lease on a very secure corporate penthouse. I signed the lease for my new corporate penthouse and was just setting my bags down on the sleek hardwood floor when my phone buzzed with an incoming video call. It was Naomi. I answered it immediately, propping the phone against a stack of boxes on the kitchen island. Naomi was sitting in her car, parked securely behind a row of tall hedges at the very end of the long gravel driveway of the historic estate. She told me she stayed behind specifically to watch the fallout and that I absolutely had to see this live. She flipped her camera around, pointing the lens directly at the front courtyard of the massive house. The estate property manager was standing on the front stone steps, flanked by 2 large private security guards. Kevin and Brenda were standing in the middle of the driveway, surrounded by a chaotic pile of hastily packed luggage. Kevin was holding his cell phone to his ear, his face flushed dark red with absolute rage. Even through the phone speaker, I could hear him screaming at the automated banking system. He was frantically reading off different credit card numbers, trying desperately to find a single account that had not been frozen by the federal government or completely maxed out. Brenda was pacing back and forth across the gravel, wearing the same overly sequined dress from the night before. Her makeup was smeared and she looked completely unhinged. She was tightly clutching her neon green designer handbag. She suddenly stopped pacing and started screaming directly at Kevin, demanding he fix the banking error immediately. She told him he was a pathetic excuse for a son and that he should have properly verified the offshore holding accounts before wiring the money. It was a stunning display of gaslighting. Just 24 hours ago, she claimed she was the untouchable financial mastermind. Now that federal agents had dismantled the fund, she was aggressively painting herself as an innocent victim of Kevin's incompetence. Kevin finally snapped under the pressure. He threw his expensive phone onto the driveway and screamed right back into his mother's face. He told her she was the one who introduced him to the scam in the first place. He yelled loudly that he committed a felony and stole his wife's house just to fund her ridiculous lifestyle. He screamed that she promised him guaranteed returns, and now he was facing massive debt. Brenda raised her hand and slapped Kevin hard across the face. The sharp, violent sound echoed across the open courtyard and clearly through the microphone. I stood in my quiet, peaceful kitchen, watching the two people who had conspired to ruin my life violently turn on each other. But the public humiliation was not quite finished. A loud, heavy diesel engine rumbled down the quiet suburban street. A massive tow truck pulled through the open iron gates, its yellow warning lights flashing brightly. It drove straight up the path and parked directly behind Kevin's leased Italian sports car. The driver stepped out holding a metal clipboard. Kevin ran over to the driver, waving his arms frantically. He aggressively lied, saying there was just a temporary banking freeze and that he would have the cash cleared by Monday morning. The driver completely ignored him. He simply verified the vehicle identification number on the dashboard, signed his clipboard, and signaled for his partner to lower the heavy towing ramp. Kevin tried to physically block the car by standing directly in front of the bumper. The estate security guards immediately marched down the steps, warning Kevin that if he interfered with a legal repossession, they would physically restrain him and call the local police. Kevin backed away in defeat. Brenda shrieked loudly as the loud hydraulic winch dragged the beautiful sports car up onto the flatbed. She cried out that her elite friends might drive by and see this happening. She was entirely fixated on her fake social reputation while her son was actively drowning. The property manager walked down the steps and handed Kevin a printed notice. He stated loudly that the final payment for the weekend rental had bounced and the caterers were pressing charges for theft of services. He told them they had exactly 5 minutes to drag their bags off the private property or the police would remove them in handcuffs. Naomi chuckled softly from the front seat of her car. She turned the camera back to her face, offering me a brilliant smile. She whispered that the fake billionaires were officially homeless. I thanked Naomi for the update and ended the call. I looked around my luxurious penthouse. Kevin had told me to sleep in a motel. Now he was the one standing on the street with absolutely nowhere to go. I spent my first few peaceful hours in the penthouse unpacking boxes and enjoying the absolute silence. The apartment was located on the top floor of a highly secure luxury tower in the center of the financial district. Floor-to-ceiling glass walls offered a stunning panoramic view of the dark Seattle skyline. The peace did not last long. My building had a strict security protocol, but Kevin was a master manipulator when he was desperate. He must have slipped past the front desk by tailgating another resident through the lobby doors. I was sitting on my velvet sofa reviewing the federal fraud statutes Oliver had sent me when I heard a heavy, frantic pounding on my front door. It was not a polite knock, it was the sound of sheer panic. I did not jump. The pounding continued, followed by the muffled sound of Kevin shouting my name through the thick mahogany wood. He was demanding that I open the door immediately. I pressed the button on the wall-mounted security intercom, bringing up the live feed from the hallway camera. The screen displayed a truly pathetic sight. Kevin and Brenda were standing in the pristine carpeted hallway, surrounded by 4 massive suitcases. Kevin looked completely disheveled. His expensive velvet jacket was wrinkled and stained from standing in the dirt outside the estate. His hair was a mess, and he was sweating profusely. Brenda looked even worse. The fake billionaire matriarch was leaning heavily against the wall, looking exhausted and entirely defeated. She was still clutching her neon green designer bag, but the arrogant smirk was completely gone. Kevin banged his fist against the door again, yelling that he knew I was inside. He told me to stop playing games and let them in because they had been wandering the streets for hours. I took a deep breath, unlocked the deadbolt, and slowly pulled the heavy door open. Kevin almost fell forward into the apartment. He caught his balance and immediately tried to push past me into the foyer. I firmly planted my hand on his chest, physically stopping him from taking another step inside. He looked at me with wild, desperate eyes. He completely ignored the fact that he had stolen my life savings and forged my signature. He reverted instantly to his entitled demands. He told me to move out of the way so his mother could sit down. He said their credit cards were temporarily frozen due to a massive banking error, and they needed a place to crash for a few weeks until his offshore funds cleared. It was incredible. Even after federal agents had raided the fake company and the towing company had repossessed his car, he was still trying to lie to my face. I stood my ground, blocking the doorway. I asked him why he was knocking on my door, when just a few days ago he told me to go sleep in a cheap motel. I reminded him that he claimed to be the man of the house and the ultimate financial provider. Kevin let out an angry, frustrated groan. He told me this was no time to hold a grudge. He pointed a finger right at my face and said we were legally married, and that meant I had a fundamental obligation to support him when times were tough. He actually used the phrase wifely duties. He told me it was my wifely duty to shelter my husband and my mother-in-law, and that I owed him my complete loyalty. Brenda peeked out from behind Kevin's shoulder. She did not yell this time. Her voice was weak and whiny. She told me she was incredibly thirsty and her feet were killing her from standing in her heels all afternoon. She asked me to be a good daughter-in-law and make her a fresh cup of hot tea while Kevin brought their heavy luggage inside. I looked at Kevin, staring at the sweat dripping down his forehead. I looked at Brenda, who had openly mocked my career and told me my assets belonged to her son. I thought about the forged deed, the fake notary, and the $800,000 they threw away just to feel important. They wanted me to be their safety net after they had intentionally pushed me off a cliff. I looked Kevin dead in the eyes. I did not raise my voice or show any emotion. I simply delivered one single resounding word. No. Kevin blinked in confusion, as if he could not comprehend the rejection. He opened his mouth to argue, but I did not give him the chance. I stepped back and slammed the heavy mahogany door directly in his face. The automatic deadbolt clicked firmly into place, echoing loudly in the quiet penthouse. The heavy click of the deadbolt had barely settled into the silence of the penthouse before the violent pounding resumed. This time, Kevin was not just using his fists. He was kicking the bottom of the solid mahogany door with his heavy leather shoes. The loud thuds vibrated through the hardwood floorboards under my feet. He was screaming my name, his voice echoing down the pristine hallway of the luxury building. I walked calmly over to the wall-mounted security panel and pressed the microphone button to activate the two-way intercom. I told him his temper tantrum was disturbing my peace, and that he was going to get himself arrested for noise complaints before I even had to call the police myself. Kevin heard my voice through the hallway speaker and immediately changed his tactics. The aggressive kicking stopped. He shifted instantly from rage to pathetic manipulation. He leaned his sweaty face directly into the camera lens and began to cry. It was a forced, ugly sob. He begged me to just open the door for one night. He claimed he was completely exhausted, starving, and that his mother was feeling faint from the stress of the day. I stared at his distorted face on the digital monitor. I pressed the button and told him that if Brenda was having a medical emergency, he should use his phone to dial for an ambulance. I told him the hospital would give her a very comfortable bed for the night, but they were absolutely not crossing my threshold. The fake tears vanished the second he realized his sympathy play had failed. His face twisted into a dark, ugly sneer. He abandoned the begging and immediately pivoted to entitled arrogance. He shouted at the camera, claiming that he was my legal husband and that gave him absolute rights to whatever property I resided in. He loudly declared that Washington is a community property state and therefore my corporate penthouse was legally his penthouse too. He ordered me to unlock the door and hand over the security access fob immediately. Brenda suddenly stepped into the camera frame, pushing Kevin aside. She whined loudly that her expensive designer luggage was getting completely ruined sitting out on the public hallway carpet. She ordered Kevin to stop talking and just force his way inside because she desperately needed to use a luxury bathroom and wanted a glass of chilled wine. I let out a short, dry laugh. I pressed the intercom button and corrected his incredibly flawed legal knowledge. I told him this penthouse was not purchased with marital funds. I explained that it was a corporate lease secured entirely under the name of my appraisal firm. I told him his name was nowhere on the contract, and he had absolutely zero legal standing to even be on this residential floor. That fact pushed Kevin completely over the edge. He lost his mind. He grabbed the brass door handle and started shaking it violently, rattling the heavy door in its frame. He screamed that he was the man of the house, and he was not going to let a disobedient wife humiliate him in a hallway. He threatened to back up and ram his shoulder into the door until he broke it completely off its hinges. He yelled that I was just a weak woman and he would physically move me out of his way the second the door gave out. I stepped away from the intercom. I walked directly up to the door. I reached out and undid the deadbolt, but I kept the heavy industrial steel security chain firmly attached to the frame. I pulled the door open exactly 4 inches. Kevin immediately lunged forward. He shoved his heavy shoe into the narrow gap, wedging it between the door and the frame, so I could not close it. He slammed his shoulder hard against the wood, trying to use his body weight to snap the security chain. The metal pulled tight, but it did not break. I did not flinch. I did not step back or scream. I stood perfectly still, my face just inches away from his red, sweating face visible through the narrow opening. I looked down at his foot and then back up to his eyes. I kept my voice terrifyingly calm. I told him the security chain was rated to withstand tremendous force, and his soft office shoulders were never going to break it. Kevin snarled at me, spitting as he spoke. He raised his fist, pulling it back as if he were going to punch straight through the gap in the door to hit me. From the hallway, Brenda cheered him on, yelling at him to show me who was the ultimate boss. I looked directly at his raised fist and I did not blink. I dared him to strike me. I slowly raised my hand and pointed a single finger through the gap, aiming at the ceiling just above his head. I told him to look up at the glowing red light of the high-definition security camera, recording our entire interaction directly to a cloud server. I told him to go ahead and commit domestic assault, because it would look fantastic sitting right next to his pending federal wire fraud indictment. Kevin froze completely. The raised fist hovered in the air. The words federal wire fraud hit him like a physical blow to the stomach. His mouth opened and closed silently as he tried to comprehend how I knew about his exact legal crimes. I told him he had exactly 3 seconds to remove his shoe from my door before I slammed it hard enough to break his ankle. He quickly pulled his foot back and I slammed the door shut, locking the deadbolt once again. I watched the hallway monitor as Kevin stared at the closed door. His face was a mask of pure disbelief. He had always relied on physical intimidation to get his way, but the thick steel frame of the penthouse door had completely neutralized him. He took a few steps back, breathing heavily, and ran his hands through his messy hair. He paced back and forth across the custom carpet, leaving faint dirt tracks from his shoes. I thought he might finally give up and drag his luggage back to the elevator. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. I leaned closer to the intercom speaker. Kevin was not calling a friend for a place to crash. He dialed 3 digits and pressed the phone to his ear. He was calling 911. The moment the dispatcher answered, Kevin completely transformed. The violent, enraged man who had just tried to force his way into my home disappeared. In his place was a terrified, desperate victim. I listened in absolute disgust as he weaponized the police against me. He told the dispatcher that he was trapped in a volatile domestic dispute and feared for his immediate safety. He cried into the phone, forcing his voice to crack perfectly. He claimed that his wife was having a severe mental breakdown and had illegally locked him and his frail elderly mother out of their shared marital home. He lied effortlessly, stating that I had maliciously stolen all of his financial assets earlier that week, and was now refusing to let him access his own clothes, his important work documents, or his daily medication. Brenda caught on to the performance immediately. She leaned against the hallway wall, dramatically clutching her chest and whimpering loudly enough for the dispatcher to hear her in the background. Kevin begged the emergency operator to send officers immediately, claiming he was worried I might destroy the expensive apartment or try to physically hurt myself in a fit of rage. He painted a masterful picture of a loving, supportive husband desperately trying to save his completely unstable and vindictive wife. He hung up the phone and looked at his mother. The fake tears instantly vanished, replaced by a sickeningly smug smile. He whispered to Brenda that the police would legally force me to open the door, and once they were inside, their presence would establish undeniable residency. He actually believed that weaponizing law enforcement would magically solve his sudden homelessness and give him the ultimate upper hand in a divorce proceeding. He thought if he got his foot in the door, the cops would tell me I had to take him to civil court to evict him. I did not panic. I did not run around the apartment frantically trying to prepare a defense. I walked calmly over to my leather briefcase resting on the pristine kitchen island. I pulled out the thick stapled stack of paper that contained my corporate lease agreement. The legally binding document clearly showed the property was leased entirely by my commercial appraisal firm, with me listed as the sole authorized corporate occupant. I set the lease on the cold marble counter, right next to my state-issued ID. Then I poured myself a fresh glass of sparkling water and walked casually back to the security monitor to watch the show. 10 minutes later, the elevator doors chimed at the end of the hall. Two uniformed police officers stepped out, walking briskly toward my door. Their hands rested cautiously on their utility belts, clearly expecting a highly volatile and dangerous domestic situation based on Kevin's desperate, frantic phone call. The moment Kevin saw the officers, he launched into an award-winning theatrical performance. He rushed toward them, his hands raised in a non-threatening gesture, and immediately started sobbing. It was a pathetic display. He told the officers he was so grateful they had arrived. He pointed a trembling finger at my solid wood door, claiming he had been standing out in the cold hallway for hours just trying to peacefully reason with me. He told the cops that we were legally married, and that I had suddenly snapped, locking him out of our shared apartment without warning. He claimed his name was on the lease, and that I was illegally withholding his personal property. Brenda chimed in on cue, using a fragile, trembling voice. She told the officers that I was a deeply disturbed woman who had stolen all of their money and left them completely destitute on the streets. She dabbed her perfectly dry eyes with a tissue, asking the cops to please just help her gentle son get back into his own peaceful home. The older of the two officers nodded sympathetically, pulling out a small notepad. He asked Kevin for his identification to verify his address. Kevin patted his pockets, acting flustered. He claimed his driver license and all his important legal documents were locked inside the apartment with his crazy wife. He begged the officers to just use force to open the door, saying I was wildly unpredictable and needed to be handled with strict, unquestionable authority. The officers exchanged a brief look, assessing the massive pile of expensive luggage and the two seemingly distraught citizens. The older officer stepped up to my door. He knocked firmly 3 times using the heavy brass knocker. He announced himself loudly as the Seattle Police Department, asking me to open the door and step into the hallway to peacefully resolve the domestic dispute. Kevin stood behind the officers, crossing his arms and puffing out his chest with a look of absolute arrogant triumph. He thought he had finally won the war. He thought the police uniform automatically commanded my total submission. I set down my water glass, picked up my thick corporate lease, and walked confidently toward the door, ready to absolutely destroy his pathetic illusion. I unfastened the heavy steel security chain and swung the door wide open. The two police officers instantly shifted their stances, bracing themselves for the unpredictable and dangerous woman Kevin had just described. Instead, they found me standing perfectly still, wearing my sharp charcoal suit, holding a neatly organized stack of legal documents. I did not look panicked. I did not look crazy. I looked like a woman who dealt with angry men and property disputes for a living. Kevin immediately tried to push past the officers. He pointed his finger right at my face and yelled at the cops to arrest me or force me to hand over the keys. The older officer raised his hand firmly, placing it directly against Kevin's chest and physically pushing him back into the hallway. He ordered Kevin to lower his voice and step away from the doorway. Then the officer turned to me, his expression cautious but professional. He asked me if I was the primary resident of this apartment and if I could explain why my husband was locked out with all his luggage. I smiled politely and handed the officer my state-issued identification card, along with the thick stapled lease agreement. I kept my voice calm and completely level. I told the officer that the man in the hallway was indeed my husband, but he did not live here, and he had absolutely no legal right to enter the premises. I explained that we were currently separated due to severe financial fraud, and that I had secured this property strictly for my own safety. The officer looked down at the lease. He scanned the front page, his eyes moving quickly over the bold black text. I watched his expression shift from cautious suspicion to absolute clarity. He flipped to the second page, checking the authorized signatures, and then looked at my identification card to verify my name. He turned around and looked at Kevin. The officer's voice lost all of its previous sympathy. He told Kevin that this was not a residential lease signed by a married couple. He stated clearly that the property was legally leased by a commercial real estate appraisal firm, and that my name was listed as the sole authorized corporate occupant. He looked Kevin up and down, noting the sweat on his velvet jacket. He told Kevin his name was nowhere on the document, and therefore he had zero legal standing to demand entry. Kevin's face turned bright red. He stammered loudly, waving his arms in the air. He tried to argue the exact same flawed logic he had used on me earlier. He yelled that Washington is a community property state, and because we were married, he was automatically entitled to half of the corporate penthouse. The younger officer let out a tired sigh, resting his hand on his radio. He told Kevin that he was deeply confused about how the law actually worked. The officer explained that property disputes are strictly a civil matter for a divorce court to decide, not something the police enforce in a hallway. Kevin opened his mouth to argue again, but I cut him off. I looked directly at the older officer and formally requested that the two individuals in the hallway be officially trespassed from the building. I stated that they were harassing me, causing a public disturbance, and that I felt threatened by his previous attempt to force the door open. The older officer nodded firmly. He turned his full attention to Kevin and Brenda. He pointed a stern finger down the long carpeted hallway toward the elevators. He issued a formal verbal warning stating that they were officially trespassing on private property. He told them they had exactly 2 minutes to pick up their luggage and exit the building completely. He warned them that if they refused to leave, they would both be immediately arrested and booked into the county jail for criminal trespassing. Brenda let out a sharp gasp of pure horror. The idea of being handcuffed completely broke her fake billionaire facade. She scrambled to grab the handles of her heavy designer suitcases, her hands shaking violently. She aggressively hissed at Kevin, telling him to grab the rest of the bags before they ended up in a dirty jail cell. Kevin was completely humiliated. His grand master plan to weaponize the police had backfired spectacularly. He was forced to grab the heavy luggage and drag it awkwardly down the hallway while the armed police officers stood by my door watching his every move. Just as the elevator doors chimed and slid open, Kevin stopped. He turned around, his face twisted in absolute rage. He screamed at the top of his lungs, echoing down the corridor. He yelled that he was hiring a ruthless lawyer and suing me for massive alimony. He screamed that he was going to take half of my paycheck for the rest of my life. I just smiled as the officers watched him step into the elevator. He wanted half my paycheck, but he was about to need a public defender to save him from federal prison. I thanked the officers, stepped back inside, and closed my door. The corporate shield had held perfectly. Now it was time for the legal trap to snap shut. 3 days passed in absolute silence after Kevin was escorted out of my building by the Seattle police. I used that time to work closely with my attorney, Oliver, finalizing the mountain of federal and civil evidence we had compiled. On Thursday morning, an email arrived in my inbox. It was an official demand for a mediation meeting regarding temporary spousal support. I checked the sender address and immediately started laughing. Kevin had not hired a prestigious downtown law firm. He had hired a discount lawyer who operated out of a strip mall next to a dry cleaner. I forwarded the email to Oliver. He called me exactly 1 minute later, his voice thick with amusement. He told me we were not going to invite them to his high-security corporate office. He said a cheap lawyer deserved a cheap venue. He booked a table at a loud, crowded coffee shop downtown. I arrived at the coffee shop on Friday afternoon wearing a sharp navy blue tailored suit. Oliver was already waiting at a corner booth. He looked like a beautifully dressed apex predator in his bespoke charcoal pinstripe suit and silk tie. His expensive leather briefcase rested casually on the table. We ordered black coffee and waited. 10 minutes later, the front bell chimed and Kevin walked in. He was wearing his velvet jacket again, but it looked even worse now, clearly unwashed and deeply wrinkled. Following closely behind him was his discount legal representation. The lawyer was a short man wearing a shiny, ill-fitting brown suit. He was clutching a thick, disorganized manila folder that looked like it was about to burst open. He was sweating heavily before he even reached our table. Kevin marched over with a look of supreme, arrogant confidence. He actually believed that bringing any lawyer to the table gave him the ultimate upper hand. He sat down heavily across from me, crossing his arms, while his lawyer scrambled into the booth next to him. The lawyer dropped his messy folder onto the wooden table with a loud slap. He introduced himself as Mr. Gibson, using a loud, aggressive voice clearly designed to intimidate me. He did not even bother to properly acknowledge Oliver, who simply sat back taking a slow sip of his black coffee. Gibson immediately launched into a rehearsed speech. He pointed a stubby finger at me, declaring that I had maliciously and intentionally abandoned my legal spouse during a time of financial hardship. He claimed my actions had caused Kevin severe emotional distress and forced him into sudden homelessness. Gibson pulled a poorly typed document from his folder and slid it across the table. He stated that his client was formally demanding $5,000 a month in temporary spousal support effective immediately. He said this was my one and only chance to settle the matter quietly. He claimed that if I refused to sign the agreement and set up the direct deposit, he would drag me into family court and demand a judge garnish my wages. It was a pathetic attempt at legal bullying. Kevin leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. He looked at me with a smug, victorious smile. He told me he was willing to be generous. He said if I agreed to the $5,000 a month and formally apologized to him and Brenda, he would instruct his lawyer to drop the lawsuit. He claimed he still loved me and just wanted me to realize that a wife cannot simply throw her husband away when things get complicated. He actually thought he was holding all the cards. I did not reach for the paper. I did not show a single ounce of fear or anger. I just looked at the poorly drafted document and then looked up at Kevin. I turned my head slightly to look at Oliver. Oliver had not opened his expensive leather briefcase. He simply rested his hands on the table and let out a soft, genuine laugh. Oliver looked at Gibson with the kind of pity reserved for a wounded animal. He told Gibson that his loud voice was very entertaining, but his legal standing was completely non-existent. Gibson puffed out his chest, demanding to know who Oliver was. Oliver smiled a terrifying, cold, and predatory smile. He introduced himself as the senior partner of the most ruthless corporate litigation firm in the state. The loud, aggressive discount lawyer suddenly shrank back into the booth, realizing he had just brought a plastic knife to a gunfight. I took a sip of my coffee, matching Oliver's cold smile. Kevin's arrogant smirk began to fade as the terrifying reality of his situation started to settle over the table. The coffee shop was filled with the background hum of espresso machines, but our corner booth felt completely frozen. Oliver, cold introduction hung in the air like a physical weight. Mr. Gibson, the discount lawyer, swallowed hard, pulling at the tight collar of his shiny brown suit. He looked down at his poorly typed spousal support demand as if he suddenly realized it was written on a napkin. Kevin, however, was too wrapped in his own narcissism to read the room. He shifted in his seat, attempting to physically brush off Oliver's intimidating presence. He let out a loud, arrogant scoff, telling Oliver that an expensive business card did not change the laws of marriage. Kevin leaned across the wooden table, pointing a finger at me. He said I was legally obligated to maintain his standard of living regardless of who was sitting next to me. He actually believed that hiring an attorney was just a bluff. He thought because the $800,000 was currently trapped in a frozen federal investigation, I was completely out of options. Before Oliver could respond, the heavy glass door of the coffee shop swung open with a loud chime. Brenda marched inside. She had not been invited to this legal mediation, but boundaries meant absolutely nothing to her. She looked terrible wearing oversized sunglasses indoors and a wrinkled designer trench coat over sweatpants. She dragged a large leather tote bag behind her, aggressively making her way toward our booth. Mr. Gibson looked up in confusion, asking Kevin who this woman was. Kevin sighed loudly, clearly annoyed by his mother's sudden appearance, but he did not tell her to leave. Brenda ignored the lawyer completely. She stood directly over our table, looking down at me with absolute disgust. She did not say hello or apologize for crashing a private meeting. She simply slammed her hand down on the wooden table, rattling our coffee cups. She demanded to know why I was sitting around drinking coffee when my husband was currently sleeping on a terrible mattress in a cheap motel. She spoke with a level of pure entitlement that genuinely defied logic. She pointed a trembling manicured finger at my hands and my neck. She told me I needed to immediately take off my diamond engagement ring and the vintage gold necklace my grandmother had left me. She ordered me to walk to the pawn shop at the end of the street and sell my jewelry for cash today. She said Kevin desperately needed a down payment for a luxury car, and she needed funds to secure a long-term hotel suite because her current accommodations were unacceptable. I stared at her in total silence. She and her son had stolen my house, forged my signature, and thrown the money into a Ponzi scheme. Yet here she was, interrupting a legal mediation demanding I sell my grandmother necklace to buy her son a sports car. The audacity was almost mesmerizing. I did not move. Oliver calmly picked up his coffee cup, taking a slow, deliberate sip before setting it down. He looked up at Brenda, his expression entirely devoid of emotion. He told her she was interfering in a confidential legal proceeding and needed to step away from the table immediately. Brenda scoffed, waving her hand at Oliver, telling him to mind his own business because this was a private family matter. Oliver smiled that terrifying, predatory smile again. He leaned forward, intertwining his fingers on the table. He told Brenda and Kevin that their refusal to acknowledge reality was truly fascinating. He explicitly warned them that every single word they spoke was being documented and added to a rapidly growing pile of criminal evidence. He said their sheer entitlement was actively digging a legal grave so deep they would never see the sun again. Kevin threw his head back and laughed loudly, drawing stares from other patrons. He crossed his arms, looking at Oliver with a smug, victorious sneer. He said Oliver could throw around empty threats all he wanted, but the reality was I had absolutely no leverage left. Kevin proudly declared that the house was legally sold to a cash buyer and the money was locked up in an SEC freeze. He stated that I was totally powerless and that a judge would force me to pay him alimony out of my corporate salary. He looked me dead in the eyes and told me I was trapped. I just smiled back at him, taking a slow sip of my coffee. He had absolutely no idea who was about to walk through that door. The heavy glass door of the coffee shop chimed again, cutting through Kevin's obnoxious laughter. I watched over the rim of my coffee cup as Naomi stepped inside. She did not look like the quiet, observant daughter-in-law who usually sat in the corner at family dinners. She looked like absolute corporate royalty. She was wearing a flawlessly tailored crimson power suit, sharp black stilettos, and carrying a massive silver aluminum briefcase. She walked across the tiled floor with a terrifying level of authority, her heels clicking rhythmically against the floorboards. Kevin stopped laughing immediately. He frowned, clearly confused by her sudden presence. Brenda rolled her eyes, leaning back in her seat with a loud, dramatic sigh. She immediately reverted to her usual toxic behavior, treating Naomi like an uninvited hired servant. Brenda waved her hand dismissively in the air, shooing Naomi away. She loudly told Naomi that she had absolutely no business being downtown right now. Brenda said this was a highly confidential legal mediation regarding her son and that the adults were talking. She looked Naomi up and down, sneering at her beautiful suit. Brenda told her that wearing flashy red did not magically make her an executive and actually snapped her fingers pointing toward the barista counter. She ordered Naomi to go make herself useful and buy her a fresh iced latte with oat milk because her throat was dry from dealing with my stubbornness. Naomi did not blink. She did not turn toward the counter. She walked straight up to our booth and slammed the heavy silver briefcase directly onto the center of the wooden table. The sheer weight of the metal case landed right on top of Mr. Gibson, poorly typed spousal support demand, pinning it permanently to the wood. The loud, aggressive thud echoed through the coffee shop, causing Mr. Gibson to literally jump in his seat and spill a few drops of water on his cheap brown suit. Kevin glared at Naomi, his face flushing with sudden anger. He demanded to know what was wrong with her, telling her to grab her obnoxious briefcase and wait outside in her car. He said she was ruining his negotiation and that she had no right to embarrass his mother in public. Naomi rested both of her hands flat on the top of the silver briefcase. She looked down at Kevin and then shifted her piercing gaze directly to Brenda. Her voice was incredibly smooth but carried the heavy weight of an absolute executioner. She told them they were both suffering from a severe psychological delusion. She clearly stated that she was not standing in this coffee shop as their family member. She said she was not there as a daughter-in-law, an aunt, or a supportive relative who was going to take their abuse anymore. Mr. Gibson wiped a large bead of sweat from his forehead, adjusting his tight collar. He tried to muster some legal authority, puffing out his chest. He asked Naomi exactly who she was and what right she had to interrupt a private civil settlement protected by attorney-client privilege. Naomi looked at the discount lawyer with a gaze so sharp it could cut glass. She introduced herself using her full professional title. She stated that she was the senior lead forensic auditor for the Independent Financial Regulatory Board. She calmly explained that for the past 48 hours, she had been working directly in tandem with federal investigators, the Securities and Exchange Commission, and the FBI field office to unravel a massive offshore Ponzi scheme. The color instantly drained from Kevin's face. He looked at the silver briefcase and then looked back at Naomi, his mouth opening and closing silently. Brenda pulled off her oversized sunglasses, her eyes wide with sudden, genuine terror. The arrogant entitlement that had fueled her just moments ago completely evaporated into thin air. She stammered heavily, asking Naomi what she was talking about, and how she could possibly be involved with the federal government. Oliver took a slow sip of his coffee, watching the absolute destruction unfold with a deeply satisfied expression. He gave Naomi a small, respectful nod, acknowledging a fellow apex predator in the room. Naomi smiled. It was the exact same chilling smile she had given Brenda at the family dinner, right before handing me the flash drive under the table. She looked directly at Brenda and told her that it turns out being a glorified calculator comes with a massive amount of federal security clearance. She explained that when the government seized the fake investment fund, they needed a forensic expert who already had an intimate understanding of the money trail. She said she volunteered for the task, and the federal agents were absolutely thrilled with the detailed financial map she had already provided them. Mr. Gibson started shaking. He grabbed the edge of the wooden table, looking frantically between Kevin and Naomi. He realized in real time that his client was not just a disgruntled husband seeking alimony. His client was the primary target of an active federal criminal investigation. Naomi popped the heavy metal latches on the briefcase. The sharp mechanical click sounded exactly like the cocking of a loaded weapon. She told Kevin that he thought I had no leverage because the money was frozen. She smiled coldly and said the money was indeed frozen, but the evidence of how it got there was fully thawed and ready to be served. Naomi flipped the heavy metal latches open. She reached into the velvet-lined interior of the silver briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of printed ledgers, bank statements, and highlighted email transcripts. She spread them methodically across the wooden table, completely covering Mr. Gibson's pathetic spousal support demand. The documents bore official federal watermarks and the stark blue logo of the Securities and Exchange Commission. Naomi tapped a manicured finger on the top page. She told Kevin to look very closely at the dates and the sender addresses. She explained that forensic accounting is simply the art of making numbers tell the absolute truth when desperate people decide to lie. Naomi looked directly at Brenda, who was visibly trembling now. Naomi stated that Brenda had been playing the role of the oblivious, gullible victim all week. Brenda had aggressively pushed the narrative that she was just a trusting woman who got swindled by sophisticated offshore brokers. But the federal wiretaps and the seized servers told a completely different story. Naomi pulled out a specific chain of emails between Brenda and the lead broker of the fake fund. She read the highlighted text out loud. The emails proved unequivocally that Brenda knew the fund was completely insolvent a full month ago. The broker had explicitly told Brenda that the only way she could extract her initial phantom profits was by injecting massive amounts of fresh capital from new, unsuspecting investors. Brenda was not a victim at all. She was an active, knowing recruiter in a criminal enterprise. Naomi did not stop there. She pulled out a detailed financial flowchart tracing the flow of illicit funds. She pointed out 12 specific names branching out directly beneath Brenda's primary account. They were all family members. They were the aunts, the uncles, and the cousins. They were the very same people who had been drinking expensive champagne at the tacky estate party just a few days prior. Naomi explained that Brenda had aggressively recruited her own flesh and blood, convincing them to take out second mortgages and drain their retirement accounts based on total lies. Brenda had used her own family as human shields, feeding their life savings into the collapsing pyramid scheme just to buy herself a little more time to escape. Kevin stared at the flowchart. His eyes traced the thick red line that connected his name directly to his mother account. Naomi tapped her finger right on the $800,000 wire transfer. She looked at Kevin with a mixture of pity and absolute disdain. She told him that his mother did not bring him a guaranteed business venture. She brought him a desperate bailout. Naomi explained that the moment Kevin's stolen money hit the offshore account, Brenda immediately tried to route a large percentage of it directly into her own private hidden wallet. She had completely sacrificed her golden boy, knowing fully well he was using a forged deed and stolen funds just to save her own skin. The silence at the table was heavy and suffocating. Kevin slowly lifted his head. The realization of what his mother had actually done washed over his face, replacing his usual arrogance with a terrifying hollow rage. He looked at Brenda. Brenda shrank back into the booth, her hands raised defensively. She stammered, trying to weave another desperate lie, claiming the emails were taken out of context and that she was just trying to secure their generational wealth. Kevin did not let her finish. He slammed his fists down on the table so hard the coffee cups rattled violently against the saucers. He screamed at his mother, his voice cracking with pure venom. He yelled that she had intentionally set him up. He screamed that he had committed federal wire fraud and destroyed his marriage just because she needed a pathetic scapegoat to pay off her own criminal debts. Brenda immediately fired back, her own vicious, narcissistic nature taking over completely. She shrieked that Kevin was a grown man who made his own greedy choices. She blamed him for being stupid enough to forge a legal document in the first place, telling him he was entirely responsible for his own mess. She yelled that she only did what she had to do to survive and that a good son would gladly take the fall for his mother instead of whining like a coward. The mother and son viciously tore into each other right in the middle of the crowded coffee shop. They screamed obscenities, pointing fingers, and violently shifting blame. They entirely forgot about me, about Oliver, and about the terrified discount lawyer sitting next to them. Kevin yelled that he was going to call the FBI right now and testify against her to save himself. Brenda shrieked that she would disown him and make sure he rotted in a federal cell completely alone. The alliance of the two people who had conspired to ruin my life had completely self-destructed. I took a slow sip of my coffee, watching them burn their own fake empire to the ground. The screaming match between Kevin and Brenda reached a fever pitch. They were completely ignoring the fact that they were in a public place. Kevin was standing up, leaning over the table and aggressively pointing his finger right at his mother's face. Brenda was shouting back, her face twisted in an ugly defensive sneer. I watched them tear each other apart for another full minute before Oliver decided he had seen enough. Oliver did not raise his voice. He simply reached out and tapped his gold pen twice against his ceramic coffee cup. The sharp clinking sound cut through the chaos instantly. He told them to sit down and shut up. Kevin dropped back into the booth, his chest heaving with heavy breaths. Brenda crossed her arms, looking away in bitter silence. Oliver smoothly unlatched his expensive leather briefcase. He reached inside and pulled out a sleek black dossier, setting it gently on the table. He pressed his fingertips against the edge of the folder and slowly slid it across the smooth wood until it bumped directly against Kevin's folded hands. Oliver looked at Kevin with eyes completely devoid of warmth. He advised Kevin to stop worrying about what his mother did with the money, because he had a much more immediate problem to deal with. Kevin stared at the black folder as if it were a live explosive. He did not open it. Oliver smiled, leaning back in his chair, and decided to read the contents out loud for the benefit of everyone at the table. He started with the state charges. Oliver explained that under Washington law, forging a spouse signature on a quitclaim deed using a disgraced and unlicensed notary is not a simple marital misunderstanding. It is forgery in the first degree and a massive felony. He noted that the county prosecutor aggressively pursues real estate fraud to protect the integrity of the property registry. Oliver stated that Kevin could face up to 10 years in a state penitentiary just for the act of signing my name. But Oliver was not finished. He smoothly transitioned to the federal level. He pointed to Naomi's stack of SEC documents and then back to his black folder. He explained the concept of federal wire fraud to Kevin using very slow and deliberate words. He said that the moment Kevin took the $800,000 obtained through state-level forgery and used an electronic banking system to wire those stolen funds into a fraudulent offshore account, he triggered a massive federal jurisdiction. Oliver informed Kevin that federal wire fraud carries a penalty of up to 20 years in federal prison per count. And because the money moved through multiple banking channels, there were several counts ready to be filed. Mr. Gibson, the discount lawyer, was suddenly looking very pale. While Oliver was speaking, Gibson had slowly pulled the black dossier toward himself. He opened the cover and began reading the impeccably drafted criminal complaint that Oliver was preparing to hand over directly to the district attorney and the FBI. Gibson's eyes darted rapidly across the pages. He looked at the hard evidence of the fake notary. He looked at Naomi's official federal forensic accounting badges and the seized email transcripts proving the Ponzi scheme. The cheap, shiny brown suit he was wearing suddenly seemed suffocating. Kevin turned to his lawyer, his voice trembling with renewed panic. He asked Gibson what they were supposed to do and demanded that Gibson file an emergency injunction to protect him. Gibson did not answer immediately. He was staring at a printed copy of the forged deed with his mouth slightly open. The realization hit him like a freight train. His client had lied to him completely. Kevin had hired him, claiming this was a standard bitter divorce where a rich wife was hiding assets. Gibson suddenly realized he was sitting at a table with two active targets of a massive federal fraud investigation. Gibson slammed the black folder shut. He frantically reached across the table and grabbed his own messy manila folder, shoving it forcefully into his battered briefcase. Kevin reached out and grabbed Gibson's sleeve, asking him where he was going. Gibson violently yanked his arm away. He looked at Kevin with a mixture of anger and sheer terror. He raised his voice loudly enough for the entire coffee shop to hear. Gibson stated explicitly that he was retained for a simple family court spousal support mediation. He yelled that he does not practice federal criminal defense, and he absolutely refuses to be an accessory after the fact to a multi-million-dollar wire fraud conspiracy. He formally declared right then and there that he was immediately withdrawing as Kevin's legal counsel. Kevin begged him to stay, reaching for the briefcase, but Gibson was already standing up. The discount lawyer bumped into the table, spilling cold water across the wood. He turned around, pushed his way past a confused barista, and literally ran out the front door of the coffee shop. The chime of the door echoed loudly in his wake. Kevin was left sitting perfectly still, completely abandoned, stripped of his legal shield, and staring directly at the team of professionals who were about to end his life. The bell above the coffee shop door swung back and forth. The chime faded into the ambient hum of the espresso machine and the low chatter of other patrons. Kevin stared at the empty space where his lawyer had just been sitting. His mouth was slightly open. The reality of his total isolation was a physical weight in the air. He looked over at his mother. Brenda was staring blankly at the wooden table, completely paralyzed by the federal documents Naomi had laid out. The great matriarch had nothing left to say. Her fake empire was gone, and her golden boy was about to face a federal judge. Kevin slowly turned his head back toward our side of the booth. His chest was heaving with rapid, shallow breaths. He wiped a thick layer of sweat from his forehead, using the sleeve of his velvet jacket. The expensive fabric he had bought with my stolen money was now stained and wrinkled. The arrogant entitlement that usually defined his posture was entirely gone, replaced by the frantic, erratic energy of a cornered animal. He knew he was trapped. He knew Oliver had the state prosecutor on speed dial, and Naomi had a direct line to the FBI. But a narcissist never truly surrenders. When they realize they cannot win the game, their only remaining goal is to make sure you lose just as badly. I watched the terror in Kevin's eyes slowly harden into pure, concentrated spite. He leaned forward across the table, bracing his weight on his forearms. He bared his teeth in a twisted, ugly smile that did not reach his eyes. He told me I must feel incredibly proud of myself. He said I brought a high-powered corporate litigator and a federal forensic accountant just to bully my own husband. He laughed, a dry, harsh sound that scraped the back of his throat. He said I always had to be the smartest person in the room. He called me a cold, calculating machine who cared more about property values and legal titles than her own family. He was trying to provoke an emotional reaction, desperately searching for a vulnerability he could exploit. I simply maintained eye contact, my expression entirely blank. Oliver sat quietly beside me, resting his hands on the black dossier, allowing Kevin to hang himself with his own words. Naomi watched him with clinical detachment, like a scientist observing a rat in a maze. The absolute silence from our side of the table infuriated him further. Kevin slammed his hand flat against the table, rattling the coffee cups. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a vicious, venomous whisper. He told me that Oliver could draft all the criminal complaints in the world. He said Naomi could hand over every single bank statement to the federal government. He leaned his face toward mine and snarled that I could throw him in a state penitentiary for forgery and let the federal agents lock him away for wire fraud. He said he might be going down, but he was taking my pristine, perfect life down with him. He pointed a shaking finger right at my chest. He declared loudly that he had still won. He told me I could put him in jail, but I still lost my precious house. His voice rose, carrying a sick, triumphant glee. He reminded me that the $800,000 was completely gone, vaporized by the SEC freeze and his mother's massive debts. He said the money was never coming back, and I was a fool for thinking I had defeated him. Kevin leaned back in the booth, crossing his arms in a pathetic display of fake dominance. He told me a legitimate cash buyer had the legal deed to the property now. He said the paperwork was filed, the transaction was complete, and there was absolutely nothing a corporate lawyer could do to reverse a clean cash sale to an innocent third party. He smiled, his teeth gritted in malicious joy. He said I would be living in a corporate rental for the rest of my life because he had successfully liquidated my greatest accomplishment. He sat there, sweating, ruined, facing decades in federal prison, yet clinging to the sick satisfaction that he had destroyed my financial security. He thought this was his ultimate trump card. He thought he had dealt me a blow I could never recover from. He waited for me to cry, to scream, to show any sign of devastation over the absolute loss of my home. I looked at Kevin. I looked at the sweat dripping down his temple. I looked at Brenda, who was silently weeping behind her oversized sunglasses. I let his declaration hang in the air for a long, heavy moment. Then very slowly, I leaned forward. I rested my elbows on the table, radiating absolute control. He thought he had sold my house to a stranger. It was finally time to show him exactly who he was dealing with. I kept my hands resting gently on the wooden table. Kevin was breathing heavily, a sick smile of triumph plastered across his sweaty face. He actually believed he had delivered the ultimate checkmate. I let the silence stretch for a long moment, allowing his arrogant words to settle over the crowded coffee shop. Oliver did not move a muscle. Naomi simply raised a single perfect eyebrow, looking at Kevin as if he were a particularly slow child. I looked at the beads of sweat forming on Kevin's upper lip. Then very slowly, I leaned forward. I did not raise my voice, but my tone was sharp enough to cut right through his pathetic delusion. I asked him if he honestly forgot what I did for a living. I told him I am a senior commercial real estate appraiser. I do not just walk around looking at nice kitchens and checking the condition of hardwood floors. I deal with multi-million-dollar property titles, complex deeds, and strict legal boundaries every single day of my life. I told him that anyone in my position, anyone who actually understands how to protect their wealth, has an automated fraud alert securely attached to their property title. I explained that it is a basic digital tripwire. If anyone so much as attempts to query the deed, alter the title, or transfer ownership of my house, I receive an instant high-priority notification directly to my phone. I watched the smug smile slowly melt off his face as the reality of my words began to register. I told him that I did not find out about the fake quitclaim deed when I arrived home from Dubai and found a stranger on my porch. I told him I found out the exact second his disgraced unlicensed notary submitted the forged paperwork to the county clerk. I was sitting in my hotel room in the United Arab Emirates when the alert popped up on my screen. I knew he was actively trying to steal my house before the ink on his fake signature was even dry. Kevin swallowed hard, his eyes darting frantically to Oliver and then back to me. He stammered, trying to interrupt my momentum, claiming that the house was still sold to a legitimate cash buyer and the title was legally transferred out of my name. He clung to that single fact like a life raft in a hurricane. I smiled a genuine, deeply satisfied smile. I told him he was absolutely right. The transaction went through perfectly. I asked him if he ever bothered to look at the actual legal name of the private entity that purchased the house. I asked if he just saw a briefcase full of cash and completely blinded himself to the legal details out of pure greed. I explained that the cash buyer was a limited liability company, a shell LLC, registered in the state of Delaware. I asked him if he knew who the primary shareholders of that specific LLC were. Kevin stared at me, his face draining of all color. He could not speak. Naomi reached into her silver briefcase, pulled out a crisp sheet of paper, and slid it across the table. It was the Articles of Incorporation. Kevin's eyes dropped to the page, landing directly on the two executive signatures at the bottom. I leaned in even closer, making sure he heard every single syllable. I told him that the shell company was established and completely controlled by two people, myself and Naomi. Naomi offered a bright, cheerful wave from her side of the booth. I told Kevin that while he thought he was pulling off the financial heist of the century, he was actually just following a script we wrote for him. When the title alert was triggered in Dubai, I immediately contacted Naomi. We knew he was desperate to liquidate the house quickly to fund Brenda offshore scam, so we gave him exactly what he wanted. We provided the perfect hassle-free cash buyer. I told him the stranger on the porch was just a private investigator I hired to play a role. I told Kevin he did not sell my house to a stranger. He sold my house right back to me. Brenda let out a loud gasp, her hands flying to cover her mouth in absolute horror. Kevin gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning completely white. He shook his head frantically, trying to find a hole in the logic. He argued that it did not matter who bought it, because he still walked away with $800,000 in real cash, and that money was now gone. He shouted that he had still bankrupted me. I let out a soft laugh. I asked him where he thought a newly formed shell company got $800,000 in liquid cash with absolutely zero notice. I explained that as the director of a highly successful commercial firm, I temporarily borrowed the funds directly from my own corporate treasury. I approved the short-term corporate loan myself, wired it to our LLC, and used my own company money to buy my own house from my thieving husband. I told him the money he wired to his mother was never marital equity. It was closely monitored, highly restricted corporate capital. He had not bankrupted me. He had just stolen nearly $1 million from a major commercial enterprise and left a perfect digital trail proving he did it. Kevin stared at me with wide, unblinking eyes. His brain was struggling to process the massive legal distinction I had just laid out on the table. In his arrogant mind, taking money from a wife was just an aggressive marital dispute that family courts usually brush off or divide in mediation. But taking money from a registered commercial corporation under false pretenses was a completely different universe of consequences. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. Oliver decided it was the perfect moment to step in and deliver the final crushing blow. He casually adjusted his silk tie and leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. He told Kevin that stealing marital assets is messy, but stealing corporate funds is a fast track to a federal indictment. Oliver pointed to the SEC documents Naomi had provided. He explained the exact lethal mechanics of the trap Kevin had blindly walked into. Oliver stated that when the LLC purchased the house, the funds were dispersed directly to Kevin based on the forged quitclaim deed. Kevin then took those corporate funds and initiated a wire transfer. Because he used a banking portal to move that money across state lines and eventually into an offshore account, he actively committed federal wire fraud. Oliver clarified that the federal government does not care about his marriage. The Department of Justice only cares that he used electronic communication to facilitate the theft and laundering of corporate assets into a known Ponzi scheme. Oliver tapped his gold pen against the table, noting that every single click of Kevin Mouse during that transfer added another 20 years to his potential prison sentence. Kevin was physically shaking now. His chest heaved as he frantically tried to find a loophole. He looked at Oliver and argued that the house was still technically sold to the LLC. He desperately claimed that even if he owed the money, the property was tied up in corporate litigation, and I was still homeless. It was the last pathetic defense mechanism of a man who had absolutely nothing left. Oliver offered a sharp, dismissive laugh. He told Kevin his ignorance of real estate law was genuinely staggering. Oliver explained that the moment my automated alert triggered, I did not just call Naomi to set up the shell company. I also immediately contacted the title insurance agency. Oliver pulled a certified document stamped by the county clerk from his black dossier and slid it across the table. He told Kevin to read it carefully. Oliver explained that because the original quitclaim deed was signed by a disgraced, unlicensed notary, and the signature was a proven forgery, the entire transaction was legally classified as void from the very beginning. The title insurance company had already stepped in and completely reversed the transfer. The state had officially stricken the fraudulent deed from the public record. I looked Kevin dead in the eyes and translated the legal jargon into simple reality. I told him, my house belongs entirely to me. I said the deed is perfectly clean, unencumbered, and registered exclusively under my name, just as it always was. I told him I had already moved my belongings back into the master bedroom this morning and canceled the corporate penthouse lease. I had my sanctuary back and he had absolutely no claim to it. Kevin's face turned a sickly shade of pale gray. The final pieces of the trap snapped shut around him. He had no house. He had no marital leverage. He had no fake investment portfolio. All he had was a massive legal liability. Naomi leaned over her silver briefcase and delivered the final accounting summary. She stated that because the property transfer was voided, Kevin was now legally on the hook for the missing $800,000. He had taken corporate capital under fraudulent terms and wired it to a criminal enterprise. Naomi told him that my appraisal firm was formally filing a civil suit for the immediate return of the stolen funds, plus punitive damages. She added that the civil suit would run simultaneously with the federal criminal charges. Kevin slumped back into the booth as if all the bones in his body had suddenly evaporated. The velvet jacket he wore looked like a cheap costume on a defeated man. He looked over at his mother. Brenda was pressing her hands over her ears, staring blankly at the tabletop, refusing to accept the reality of her own impending arrest. They had walked into the coffee shop expecting to bully me into paying them a monthly allowance. Instead, they were leaving with the absolute certainty that they would spend the next several decades locked inside a federal penitentiary. The sheer gravity of their total destruction sat heavily in the air, and neither of them could say a single word. The heavy silence in the coffee shop was finally broken by a sound I had never heard Kevin make before. It was a low, guttural gasp that seemed to tear its way out of his throat. The arrogant velvet jacket-wearing man who had spent the last 3 weeks demanding my complete submission was completely gone. His body physically gave out under the crushing weight of his reality. He slid off the edge of the leather booth, his knees hitting the hardwood floor with a heavy, violent thud. He was completely ignoring the shocked stares of the barista and the other customers who had stopped drinking their coffee to watch the spectacle. He reached out with trembling hands, grabbing the fabric of my trousers. The tears streaming down his face were no longer the fake calculated tears he had used to manipulate the police outside my apartment. They were the hot, desperate tears of a man staring directly into the abyss of his own making. He looked up at me from the floor, his face wet and distorted with absolute panic. He started begging. His voice was a frantic, pathetic babble of broken promises and desperate apologies. He pleaded with me to call off the civil suit. He begged me to tell Oliver to hold back the federal criminal complaints. He swore that he would spend the rest of his life working minimum wage jobs just to pay me back every single penny of the $800,000. He told me he was blinded by greed and that he never actually wanted to hurt me. He claimed he still loved me and that a husband and wife should not destroy each other over a simple financial mistake. He actually had the audacity to call a multi-million-dollar federal wire fraud conspiracy a simple mistake. When he realized my expression was not softening, he shifted his strategy. He grabbed the edge of the table, pulled himself up slightly, and pointed a shaking finger directly at his own mother. He offered to wear a federal wire. He offered to give the FBI everything they needed to lock Brenda away forever, if it meant he could just walk away with probation. He promised to testify in open court that she was the sole mastermind and that she had emotionally manipulated him into forging the legal documents. He was fully willing to sacrifice the exact woman he had stolen my house to protect. Brenda heard her son offering her up to the federal government on a silver platter, but she did not even flinch. She did not scream or throw her coffee or call him a traitor. She just sat perfectly still in the corner of the booth. Her oversized sunglasses had slipped slightly down the bridge of her nose, revealing eyes that were completely hollow. The extravagant fake billionaire who had humiliated Naomi and demanded I sell my grandmother jewelry was entirely broken. She realized that she had manipulated her son into a felony, and now her son was going to ensure she died in a prison cell. The absolute betrayal shattered whatever fragile illusion she had left. She stared at the wood grain of the table as if her mind had completely shut down, leaving behind nothing but an empty shell. I looked down at Kevin, fingers desperately gripping the hem of my suit pants. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I did not feel a lingering sense of marital loyalty. I only felt a deep, profound relief that I was finally free of his toxic gravity. I smoothly pulled my leg back, breaking his grip on my clothing. I stood up from the booth, smoothing out the creases in my navy blue jacket. Oliver calmly closed his black leather dossier and clicked the latches shut. Naomi packed the federal ledgers back into her silver briefcase, locking it with a sharp metallic snap. The three of us stood tall over the ruins of the family that had tried to destroy me. Kevin raised his hands toward me, sobbing loudly, pleading for one last chance to make it right. I looked down at him kneeling on the dirty floor of a coffee shop in a ruined velvet jacket. I kept my voice perfectly level, letting the cold, absolute certainty of my words wash over him. I told him he spent years demanding that I shrink myself to fit his fragile ego. I told him he thought my ambition was a weakness and that my money was his personal entitlement. I leaned down slightly, locking my eyes with his terrified stare. I told him he should have remembered that you never try to steal from a woman who built her own empire from the ground up, because she will always know exactly how to tear yours down. I turned my back on him. I did not look at Brenda, and I did not look back at Kevin. I walked straight toward the heavy glass doors of the coffee shop, with Oliver and Naomi flanking me like a royal guard. The door chimed cheerfully as I pushed it open, stepping out into the bright Seattle afternoon. Behind me, the sound of Kevin's sobbing echoed through the cafe, a pathetic soundtrack to the end of his arrogant life. I took a deep breath of the crisp, fresh air. Walking out of that coffee shop was the definitive end of my disastrous marriage, but it was the true beginning of my actual life. Fast forward exactly 6 months. The legal gears of the federal justice system turn deliberately and slowly, but when they finally lock into place, they crush absolutely everything in their path. Kevin did not get the lenient probation he begged for on his knees. The federal judge was entirely unamused by his pathetic attempt to blame his own mother and was completely disgusted by the blatant forgery of my signature on a legal property deed. Kevin was convicted of multiple counts of federal wire fraud and first-degree state forgery. He is currently serving an 8-year sentence in a federal correctional institution. He wears a standard-issue khaki uniform now, which is a massive downgrade from the tailored velvet jackets and expensive watches he bought using my stolen equity. His phone calls are strictly monitored, his bank accounts have been permanently seized, and his arrogant, smug smirk has been completely erased by the harsh daily reality of a concrete cell block. He has exactly 8 years to think about what happens when you try to outsmart a woman who calculates risk for a living. Brenda suffered a fate that is arguably worse for a profound narcissist, because she has to live with the public humiliation she always feared more than death. She managed to avoid federal prison by accepting a harsh plea deal, turning over state evidence against the brokers, and liquidating every single asset she possessed to pay court-ordered restitution. But it was nowhere near enough to cover the damage. The 12 family members she deliberately recruited into the Ponzi scheme sued her into absolute oblivion. She was completely excommunicated from the family tree, stripped of her fake high society status, and left entirely destitute. Today, the woman who demanded I sell my vintage grandmother jewelry to fund her luxury hotel suite lives in a dilapidated, rusted recreational vehicle parked on the dusty outskirts of a forgotten trailer park. She has no designer bags, no elite offshore accounts, and absolutely nobody left to listen to her toxic lies. Naomi, on the other hand, soared higher than ever. The morning after the coffee shop confrontation, she filed divorce papers against Kevin's younger brother, severing her ties with that diseased family tree once and for all. She parlayed her incredible forensic accounting work with the federal investigators into launching her own independent auditing firm. She is now one of the most sought-after financial auditors in Seattle, and my commercial appraisal firm retains her on a highly lucrative permanent contract. We meet for coffee once a week, not to negotiate ridiculous alimony demands, but to discuss our rapidly expanding investment portfolios. As for me, I am sitting right now on the front porch of my beautiful Craftsman home. The cool Seattle rain has washed away the last lingering traces of the man who tried to steal my sanctuary. The housing market has been incredibly kind this year. I just completed a fresh appraisal on this exact property last week, and its market value has climbed to $1.2 million. It is my house, strictly my name on the deed, and my relentless hard work built every single inch of its equity. I want to take this moment to speak directly to the women watching or listening to this story. We are raised by society to be constantly accommodating. We are conditioned to compromise, to soften our edges, and to tirelessly manage the fragile egos of the men around us. We are explicitly told that our fierce financial independence is intimidating, and that true love means sharing absolutely everything, even when the person we are sharing with brings nothing but entitlement to the table. Do not ever fall for that dangerous trap. Gaslighting thrives in the dark, and financial abuse often disguises itself beautifully as traditional romantic partnership. Protect your hard-earned assets. Understand the property laws of your state. Keep a firm, uncompromising grip on your own bank accounts, and never apologize for out-earning your partner. If a man requires you to shrink yourself, your career, or your ambition, just so he can feel large, he is not a partner. He is a parasite. Build your empire, Secure your legal title and never let anyone manipulate you into believing that your success belongs to them. Thank you so much for following my story to the very end. If you found strength in this journey, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with any woman who might need a reminder of her own inherent power. Let me know in the comments below how you establish boundaries and protect your own peace. Stay incredibly strong, trust your own instincts, and never settle for anything less than you absolutely deserve. The story of Natalie, Kevin, and Brenda serves as a masterclass in the dangers of weaponized entitlement and the absolute necessity of financial self-reliance. For generations, society has conditioned women to believe that marriage requires unconditional sacrifice. We are subtly taught to soften our edges, merge our hard-earned assets without question, and prioritize the fragile egos of our partners over our own protection. Kevin weaponized the language of wifely duties and marital trust, not to build a loving partnership, but to orchestrate a calculated financial heist. This highlights a chilling reality. Financial abuse frequently wears the comfortable mask of traditional romantic expectations. Manipulators will often use the concept of family unity to guilt you into surrendering your autonomy. The profound lesson here is that true love never demands you to blindly dismantle your own security. Natalie's ultimate triumph was not merely the result of hiring a ruthless lawyer or possessing forensic accounting skills. It was rooted in her proactive, unapologetic defense of her own worth. She understood her legal rights, maintained strict control over her separate property, and most importantly, she refused to let psychological gaslighting distort her reality. When the ultimate betrayal occurred, she did not have to beg her abuser for mercy because she had already engineered her own impenetrable safety net. We must actively unlearn the toxic narrative that financial independence is a threat to a healthy relationship. A genuine partner will celebrate your empire, not scheme to siphon it away to fund their own delusions. You are entirely allowed to be fiercely protective of the life you have built. Please share this reflection with a woman in your life to remind her that her ambition is a superpower and encourage her to take relentless ownership of her financial future today.